In this episode, we talk about the Supreme Court's directive regarding the Places of Worship Act. We also talk about the 11 Indian nationals who died in Georgia earlier this week. But first, we talk about the legacy of Zakir Hussain. Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. On Sunday, tabla maestro and 5-time Grammy Award winner Zakir Hussain passed away at a hospital in San Francisco. Hussain had been hospitalized and subsequently succumbed to idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, a rare respiratory illness that leads to an irreversible decline in lung function. A child prodigy and the son of legendary tabla master Ustad Allah Rakha, Hussain was awarded the Padma Shri in 1988, Padma Bhushan in 2002, the Padma Vibhushan in 2023, and is widely regarded as the greatest tabla player of this generation. In fact, at the Grammy Awards earlier this year, he became the first Indian to win 3 trophies in a single night: Best Global Music Album, Best Global Music Performance, and Best Contemporary Instrumental Album. To discuss his career and what set him apart, the Indian Express's Suanshu Khurana joins us. Suanshu, for many people, Zakir Hussain is perhaps the only tabla player they know by name. Could you talk about what made him so popular?
See, mainly because he didn't present that image of a stern, boring classical musician to you who would just perform, record, and go home. Zakirji loved interacting with his audience, explaining his very complex music to them, breaking it down, keeping it simple. Even though you were hearing a lot of complex stuff, these are like mathematical tals and rhythms, which are, the half matra here, half matra there. These are very complicated rhythm sets and, which he was playing, but he was sort of simplifying them so much. He knew his own form so well that he could break it down for the Western musician as well, understand what he or she was doing, and amalgamate really well with so many, which is why he could do a rock fusion, he could do a jazz fusion, he could do a very traditional Hindustani classical concert. We now call it world music, but at that time, no one had a clue. So he composed for films, he acted in some, he spoke to people, he played concerts, and he toured extensively and remained synonymous with the tabla, finding admiration and fans in India as well as abroad. Basically, I think he made a very humble instrument, spontaneous and thrilling, and I think glamorous even. And then there was that trademark, headbanging that we remember with those curly locks, This was all at full display in his live concerts when he performed and people went to see him, and people came in droves to listen to this music. The popularity just kept layering itself and adding itself, and he kept doing newer things to sort of, stay in the limelight, so to say.
And growing up in the 90s, many of us remember him from the Taj Mahal tea ad. Hindustan Thompson Associates, which is now JWT, had worked on it. How much did that contribute to his popularity, and what do we know about how that ad came about?
Oh, yes, that ad made him a household name. Basically the brand was trying to reposition itself. That's where it started, amid the aspirational middle class. And there were 2 main issues that they were facing. One was that the quality of tea was kind of going down. There was inconsistency in the taste. And the second was that what was felt about the brand was that it was more built or more suited for a Western audience. I think there was this attempt to sort of Indianize it. And now when Zakir Hussain came into that, here was tea, which was being compared to classical music, years of riyaz and carefully crafted tea, with so many tea tasters finding the perfect blend. And that Wah Taj, that catch line, also came from the Wah of the classical music, a sign of appreciation in Indian classical music, which made the link complete.
उस्ताद नजर की उस्ताद पहचान, हजारों में एक चाय, ताजमहल, क्या रंग क्या महक।
वाह उस्ताद।
अरे हुजूर वाह ताज बोलिए।
वाह ताज।
At a time when TV was new and every ad was so carefully watched, and it just blew up, and he was probably the only tabla player after his father, Ustad Allah Rakha, that then the masses knew. I mean, Ustad Allah Rakha was also, people knew of him, but Zakir was younger, sort of magnetic in terms of how he looked at the camera. It kind of became so etched in our memory from the 90s.
And talk about his early years. You mentioned, of course, his father, Ustad Allah Rakha, the famous tabla player. How early on did he introduce him to the tabla?
So the story is that when Zakir was born, his father Ustad Allah Rakha sort of whispered tabla bowls in his ear. These are syllables which are used to represent the sounds of the instrument in the son's ear instead of a prayer from the Quran, which is the tradition. So his wife was a bit angry and she asked him, why are you sort of doing this? And his answer was way too uncomplicated. He said that this is as good as worship for me. So his training actually began at 3, first as those mathematical games. He would think about these while sleeping at night. This later sort of became sophisticated rhythm patterns and stories from life that you would work with. So he was also interested. See, it's not just about what Allah Rakha offered him. He was also very interested. If there was no tabla in the house, he would just pick out a couple of pots and pans from the kitchen and start playing them. He would play the table in the school. And, by the time he was 7, 8, he was already going with his father to the concerts. And by the time he was 12, 13, he was individually doing accompanying concerts. I mean, sometimes when his father was traveling a lot with Ravi Shankar at that time, he was busy, or he would write back to the organizer saying that the son is available. Not knowing how old the son was, the organizers also said, please send him. And here was, a 13, 14-year-old child would land at the train station and organizers would just pass him by, not knowing this is the guy. This is the person who will tomorrow accompany a particular pandit of music. But Zakir was doing that. And, people were not being able to fault the music, which is why he kind of has always been called a child prodigy. So he was also very interested in the learning that, his father offered to him.
And for years, tabla players were just part of an ensemble. They were mostly in the background. Did Hussain stand out in that regard?
Back in the day, yes, tabla players were usually in the background. In the 50s and 60s, accompanying artists, be it tabla players or sarangi players, no one sort of enjoyed much of a social stature. The names of musicians did not appear on records or posters, and they were paid much less than the main artist. Tabla players were even made to sit behind the main performer. It is only now that we see this, accompanying musician sitting next to the artist or turned towards the artist a little on the side so that he or she can see, where the expressions of the artist are very important in that. At that time, the word tabalchi was used in a rather derogatory manner, which sort of at that time did not sort of deter. The contribution is actually from Ustad Allah Rakha. In the mid-60s, he decided to concentrate solely on classical music. And things sort of began to improve when his father started accompanying artists like Ustad Amjad Ali Khan and Hafiz Ali Khan. He was traveling a lot with Pandit Ravi Shankar. And, Pandit Ravi Shankar was sort of fluent in English and he began explaining Indian classical music to the Western audience. And in his explanation of the concept of rhythm, he would highlight Allah Rakha's brilliance. And then there were two other tabla giants, Pandit Krishna Maharaj and Samta Prasad, who sort of brought tabla out of those shadows of being just an accompanying instrument to actually a solo instrument. I believe this very firmly that Zakir Hussain, came at a time when he could actually climb the pedestal that they built and reached heights that, and of course there was this massive talent, innovation and everything. And he reached heights that percussionists in India sort of consider the pinnacle of success now. He was doing things, but of course he got this little push from these 3 musicians who worked really hard to bring tabla out of the shadows.
And we're talking about people that came before him. But what do you think made him stand out from his contemporaries? What sort of made him an international star in that sense?
So, the technical brilliance was always in place. But there was this thing of sort of doing newer things, sort of taking tabla into a very different direction. Now at this point, tabla is well known as the king of drums all over the world. And it is mainly because of him sort of opening himself up. His entire thing was, of course, sort of steeped in tradition, but he was also very open to other forms of music. And I think that openness, that broad-mindedness kind of took him really forward. I mean, he was different in that sense because traditional tabla players, what happens is that Indian classical musicians, sometimes they call themselves purists and then they don't want to get out of that hole that they built for themselves. With Zakir, he was very quick to adapt and change. And so while those traditional concerts that he would do in, winters in India were a home stretch for him. He kind of expanded the horizon of tabla and became that person that other tabla players aspire to. A lot of people have sort of modeled themselves. He also kind of helped promote a lot of younger artists. I mean, this is actually very unique about him. A lot of artists are also sticking to their own thing. Zakir Hussain is one of the few artists who's performing with many younger artists. I mean, be it Niladri Kumar, be it Sultan Khan Saab's son, Sabir, on Sarangi, these are all people in the 30s and 40s. And he kind of picked out artists who were brilliant. He performed with Kala Ramnath a lot, Jayanti Kumaresh a lot. And he just found brilliance in artists and performed with them. It didn't matter, that he had to perform with a very senior artist or, it was not like that. If the artist was good, he would just do it. And I think that sort of, wide perspective that he had, the larger thing, I think that kind of made him stand out massively.
And the other thing to note is that his global collaboration, the fusion band Shakti, is very well known now. It was founded in 1973 with John McLaughlin. And over the years, he worked with a lot of international artists. There was Yo-Yo Ma, Charles Lloyd, Edgar Meyer, Mickey Hart, George Harrison, of course. All of this really elevated him as an international star. But could you talk about what his later years in life were like?
Oh, very active. I think, even as he's passed away, he was performing around the globe, constantly traveling, doing newer collaborations. In fact, this year is completely booked out for him. He was to perform in January in India with Bella Fleck and Edgar Meyer. And these are the people he won one of the Grammys this time with. And it was a very looked forward to concert. Zakir Hussain was never sitting free. I mean, even though later he started saying, oh, I am in semi-retirement now, I'm over 70, now I'm going to play less. But if you saw that energy on stage, 3 hours of a concert, he was doing more than 150 concerts a year and probably doing more and more every other year. So yeah, the last years were very, very active, constantly performing. He's gone away completely at the peak of his career.
And Suanshu, in the end, what do you think Zakir Hussain will be most remembered for?
For being him, for not just for the music he created, because there are many artists who do great music, but I think he'll also be remembered for the humility he showed with that art form. Till the end, he kept saying that, I'm a student, I'm learning. One never heard him sort of tower above. I mean, even a small child who was learning, he would always be so empathetic, very, lots of humility. And I think that's where the music, and of course, there is that technical brilliance and all of that, but I think he will be remembered as the greatest tabla player of this century.
And next, we talk about the directive issued by the Supreme Court regarding the Places of Worship Act. Over the past few years, a number of district courts across the country have heard cases that question the religious character of prominent mosques or dargahs. In these cases, including the one in Varanasi, Sambhal and Ajmer, the petitioners have claimed that a Hindu temple existed at that site before, and the court has then ordered an archaeological survey of the site. But what we have discussed a number of times in the past is that this has happened despite the Places of Worship Act being in place, which explicitly forbids this.
So the 1991 Places of Worship Act was specifically enacted for this purpose.
That's the Indian Express's legal affairs editor, Apurva Vishwanath.
And this came in at a time when we were walking into what has now culminated into a Ram Mandir in Ayodhya. This is when the Babris still stood and the Ayodhya movement was at its peak. So that we don't again walk in the footsteps of Ayodhya, this special legislation was enacted. And it sort of was to put an end, to these controversies of history and to say that no matter what happened, whether it was a Hindu temple or whether it was, a Buddhist temple or a Jain temple, whatever it was, that after independence, that we will not let the country be held hostage to this history. So the cutoff date was 1947, August 15th, and the legislation said that no place of worship can have its character altered.
Meaning that if it's a Hindu temple, it continues to be a Hindu temple, and if it's a mosque, it will continue to be a mosque.
And except for the Ayodhya dispute, because that was already in the High Court by that time, except for that, any other such suits pending in courts will stand abated and no fresh suits will be filed. So this is what the law did.
Right, but despite that, like we mentioned earlier, a number of district courts were still allowing pleas of this nature and ordering these archaeological surveys. And one of the reasons this was happening was because of something that the former Chief Justice of India, D.Y. Chandrachud, had observed in a particular hearing. Could you talk about what that observation was?
So, once the Supreme Court's Ayodhya judgment came and, the temple was being built in Ayodhya on the disputed site. So after all of this, of course, the slogans had been around for a very long time that there is Kashi and Mathura after Ayodhya. And as on cue, the litigation started in these two places. When it first happened in Varanasi, the district judge who had allowed the survey of the Wazukhana in the Gyanvapi mosque, the mosque had come and appealed to the Supreme Court, asking the court to intervene and stop the survey. It is in this hearing in May 2022 that then Chief Justice of India, D.Y. Chandrachud, made an oral observation in court. And frankly, oral observations are very common in court. These things keep happening. They shouldn't be considered the final word of the court, as the Chief Justice himself said. All of that's true. But in a case as sensitive as this, on an issue that has had such an ominous history in India, in that case, the Chief Justice's words were sort of instrumental to bolster this argument that civil courts could entertain such suits.
Right, and what exactly did Justice D.Y. Chandrachud say back then?
So what the Chief Justice said was, that's true, there's this Places of Worship Act and you cannot convert the religious character of a place. But can we make an inquiry as to what was the religious character of the place as of 15th August 1947? On that date, was it a temple? Was it a mosque? And this sort of came about because in Gyanvapi, the petitioners had claimed that they did have some access to the mosque to pray to Hindu gods, that's Ma Shangar Gauri and these deities. So what was it on that day? So this line of inquiry essentially lent itself to district courts in other places, say in Mathura, in Sambhal, basically saying that there can be a civil suit and the Places of Worship Act can be bypassed to entertain such suits. Or the issue of the Places of Worship Act can only come up at a later stage. But a survey can be ordered and that itself is enough to trigger violence like we saw happen in Sambhal.
Yeah, there was Sambhal and there was another case filed regarding the Ajmer Sharif Dargah, and the fear had been that more cases could come up. And keeping that in mind, last Thursday, the Supreme Court issued a directive to the district courts across the country to essentially stop doing this. Tell us what prompted this directive, this judgment.
So this is not a judgment. It's not the final word of the court again. The Supreme Court was hearing a larger constitutional challenge to the Places of Worship Act itself. This has been a very contested legislation. Even when it was passed, the BJP, which was an opposition, fiercely attacked the P.V. Narasimha Rao government for bringing in this law. The BJP's argument was this is appeasement and such a law will not hold the court's review. So, continuing with that, it has been for about 4 years now a question of whether the Modi government will support this legislation or not. The centre has not made it stand clear in the court.
And here, could you also talk about the grounds on which this law has been challenged?
So it's been challenged on primarily two grounds, One, that it takes away the court's power to decide an issue because, the law says such suits are barred, right? And the second is that it relies on an arbitrary cutoff date. What is 1947 sort of, why 15th August? And arbitrariness and also taking away the power of judicial review are both, reasonable grounds for a legislation to be struck off. So the challenge was basically this. The court would have to examine whether, it's a valid date and, what the law aims to do and all of that. So while this larger challenge is sort of pending, the question was, can district courts keep acting in a manner that defeats the purpose of this legislation? We've discussed this many times earlier with our listeners that in India, we have a presumption of constitutionality in favor of our laws, that a law passed by the parliament duly, as in with, due process, the procedure has been followed. It is deemed to be constitutional. It should be operationalized till the court then says it is unconstitutional. So as of today, the Places of Worship Act is a valid legislation. And these often choreographed hearings in district courts, the petitions and how they sort of, turn out which is, the survey happening on the same day, the hearing on the next day. Like we saw in Samhal, the plea was filed at 1:30 in the afternoon, and about for 2:30, 3 o'clock, there was a court order. Can proceedings like these bypass the spirit of the Places of Worship Act? So that was the question before the court. So the court said, okay, for the time being, that is till we decide that this law is, say, for example, unconstitutional, district courts across the country will be barred from registering such pleas, which means, it doesn't stop you from filing them, but it only is a stopgap measure for the courts from entertaining this. So it's like a stay order. So till the court decides to issue in final, district courts will not be passing any quote-unquote effective orders.
So basically what you're saying is that petitioners can still go to any district court and file a petition in this regard, but the district courts can't hear that plea?
Yes, register it, first of all. I mean, a step before that is registering it and then hear the plea and then maybe even pass an order. None of that can happen till the Supreme Court decides this issue. So in a sense, the centre had been dragging its feet on this larger challenge because it's a political issue that can be kept alive for a later date. But now with this stay, in a sense, the urgency is also on part of the government. If you want this masjid, mandir issue to be continued and used politically, then it is on them to get this issue resolved sooner in the Supreme Court.
And as far as the Places of Worship Act is concerned, could you talk about what happens next in that matter?
So the court that day also told the centre to file its response within 4 weeks. So, whenever there's a constitutional challenge, that is a long process of written submissions filed and counter affidavits filed, so which we call it service. So that service happens for about 8 to 12 weeks, and then the court has to fix a date for hearing.
And in the end, we talk about a tragedy that transpired in Georgia. In a press release issued on Monday, Indian officials stationed in Georgia announced that 11 Indian nationals had died in the city of Godari. According to reports, the bodies were found on the second floor of a building housing an Indian restaurant at a ski resort. The victims, suspected to have died from carbon monoxide poisoning, were all employees of Haveli, an Indian restaurant located near the Georgia-Russia border. The Indian Express's Jagdeep Singh, who's been reporting on the story, tells us more about it.
So 11 people who have been reported to have been died in a Georgian hotel are from different districts of Punjab. A couple was from Sunam town in Sangru district, which is also happens to be the Punjab Chief Minister's home district. Then there are two sisters-in-law. They are from Rajpura town near Patiala. So they all come from different backgrounds. Like the Sunam couple, they had gone to Georgia last year. They wanted to do jobs in Georgia to better their future. And the man, Ravinder Singh, who died in Georgia, he was a carpenter in India. So his wife died with him. Then in Rajpura, there is a village called Mehab, the sisters-in-law. The sister Amrinder Kaur, she was 32 years old. She went to Georgia in 2015. Then she called her brother Jitinder in Georgia, but Jitinder then moved to South Korea in 2018. Then Jitinder married Maninder Kaur. She also died with Amarinder Kaur. So I spoke to the families of these victims. They are in shock because Amarinder, the woman who belongs to Meham village, her family was telling me that they spoke to her a day before her death. And she was telling them that there was a snowstorm due to which there was a blackout in the area and they switched on the genset in their lobby. So after that, the family did not receive any call. They tried to call her, but then they received a call from one of the delivery boys of the restaurant who told them that Amarinder Kaur was no more. She passed away. So all the families are in shock, and Amarinder Kaur was from very poor background. Her father sold 4 acres of land to settle his children in Georgia. Now he is a small-time farmer because he's stealing the land of one of his brothers in his village.
And Jagdeep, have we heard anything from the government regarding this matter?
See, the central government had already said that they are trying to expedite the process of bringing back the bodies so that families could perform their last rites in India. Then the matter was raised in the parliament by Amritsar MP Gurjeet Aujla also. So everybody is into shock. I mean, everybody is supporting the families right now. the central government had assured all the families that they will be bringing the bodies very soon.
You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.